Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast with Dr. Jessie Mahoney.
And Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang.
We are physicians and leaders who are also trained in coaching, yoga, mindfulness, and integrative medicine.
We are also mothers, spouses, sisters, daughters, aunts, and friends.
In this podcast, we share candid, heart-centered, loving, science-based, thoughtful, and often fun conversations about the challenges life throws at us.
With our collective experience of over 30 years in physician and personal wellness, we reflect and offer pearls of wisdom for navigating life's challenges with more ease.
From parenting, marriages, money scarcity, cancer survivorship, uncertainty, challenges in practicing medicine, we cover it all.
We invite you to refresh your perspective and empower yourself with mindset, mindfulness, and other well-being tools that actually work. A quick reminder that nothing in our podcast is medical advice.
Welcome to today's episode on opting out of toxic achievement culture. Do you want your child to do and be more than what they are capable of? Have you yourself been indoctrinated into the toxic achievement culture? Would you like to break free from the constraints of toxic achievement culture for yourself and your children? This episode is another in our ongoing Parent with Presence series. And a quick reminder to check out the previous episode called Stepping Out of the Rat Race, which has a similar flavor.
Today's episode was actually inspired by my own parenting experience of wanting success and near perfection from my eldest as an athlete. And I caught myself again thanks to mindfulness and the mindset work that I've been doing for many years and will continue to do so again and again about being part of and reinforcing toxic achievement culture. So today's intention is to call out and identify toxic achievement culture and how, to some extent, most of us have been indoctrinated in its acceptance into mainstream society. Takeaways include that through mindfulness and from our recent conversation with Koshin Paley Ellison, that dropping the word self from self-compassion, because compassion honestly inherently implies that we include ourselves, and that when we are met with experiences that bring up toxic achievement culture, we can notice it and then choose to show up for ourselves and our children in a way that is rather more nurturing, loving, with less pushing, and more walking alongside, sometimes guiding.
We will take a moment to pause to arrive here. And I'm inspired today to bring a hand to heart and another hand atop, recognizing that toxic achievement culture is a stressful topic for many of us, and sending compassion to ourselves and everyone else listening and all of our children going forward. And perhaps to reflect on this idea of showing up with love. What would love do for the fact that you were raised in potentially a toxic achievement culture? What would love do for the fact that perhaps that lens is impacting your child rearing? What would love do for our children and our future generations about this lens towards achievement? And focusing on the breath, sending compassion and love to yourself and to your children and to everyone else. Setting the intention to settle in and arrive, listen, explore, and show up with love for this conversation. So this topic of not so much toxic achievement culture, but wanting our children to achieve and worrying about how much they achieve and whether they will be okay in the long run comes up all the time in coaching. And of course, parents worry about their children's choices. And of course, we want them to succeed. And yet, what I often notice is that when a child's choice is different than a parent's, different than their own, is especially when we worry. And so it may be that many of you listening are high achievers and achievement focused and accomplished. And if you so happen to have a child that is not as achievement focused as you are or were, it can be triggering. And so mindfulness and nervous system retraining and coaching can help. It can help you and your children settle into a journey without partaking of this culture.
As you were leading us in that lovely settling practice, when you asked, what would love do? Sometimes love would actually opt out of toxic achievement culture. So I'm so glad that you brought that question into this. I also wanted to share with all of you, dear listeners, that I read the book Never Enough by Jennifer Wallace, and I highly, highly recommend it. It helped me approach how I show up for my children, especially for my eldest's academic and extracurricular pursuits.
And I just want to call out that we were trained in medicine to think that we were never enough. And you could never know enough. You could never study enough. You could never think enough. And doing more, thinking more, ruminating, all of those things were actually celebrated in medicine. And so, unless we are intentional about opting out of a toxic achievement culture, we will pass this on to our children. And I actually, at this point, also want to comment that we are calling it a toxic achievement culture, which of course means that achievement in and of itself is not bad. And we often talk about this word toxic. I talk about toxic independence, for example. And it's toxic when it causes harm to yourself, your children, your relationship. When it leads to resentment, when it leads to bitterness, when it leads to disconnection, or when it leads to mental health struggles as well. And so I just want to call out that we're not judging whether achievement in and of itself is good or bad. In fact, in my mind, we want our children to feel accomplished and to feel like they have achieved things that matter to them. And so again, it's connecting with this idea of toxic and being unhealthy or out of alignment for the life that you would like to be living, that's healthy for your nervous system, healthy for your body, and healthy for your children.
So I'll give you an example of what actually inspired this episode. Was in a recent weekend, my eldest's club coach made a drastic change in the strategy of the matches. And so the lineup changed, and there were a lot more inequities in playing time for not just my eldest, but also for the whole team. And I saw and noticed myself wanting things to be different. I wanted my child to start. I wanted my child to be one of the players that had the most playing time.
And my comment here is, of course you did, because well, first of all, as parents watching, we always would prefer to watch our own child because that's what we're there to support them, but also because we make it mean things. And so if our child is not playing as much, our brain might tell a story about them, their abilities, and our own success or achievement or accomplishments as a parent.
Story that I told myself was that the circumstances of the inequities in playing time somehow equated to failing and lack of worth, when in actuality, it was not about that at all. It was actually about trying something new. And you oftentimes can strategize during practice, but unless you bring it out forth and try it against different teams, you won't know whether or not that strategy actually works.
And it's a reminder to show up curious or hands wide open. And I think that here you made a story. It wasn't curious. Your brain auto told a familiar story, and one that I think was a habit growing up. And it was a helpful habit in some spots because it helped you achieve more, but it's not sustainable.
Yeah. And I know that this is going to be a lifelong journey for me, as I'm definitely a product of toxic achievement culture. So, sharing my own story as a first generation immigrant, my parents didn't put actually external pressures on me to excel academically because honestly, they weren't present a lot of the time because they work so much. So I actually put those pressures on me because I fell in love with external validation and the sense of worth from external sources. And I got it. Those straight A's, being captain of a co ed volleyball team, first place in Chinese school speech contests, getting into medical school. But frankly, speaking so, my parents really didn't have to worry about my brother and I academically because we had an inherent intrinsic drive that really was born out of, I think, scarcity. And so looking back, that drive has sprouted from buying into the whole hearted toxic achievement culture. And I really honestly was really good at it. But as I got older, having my own kids, I see that it definitely harmed me many, many, many years later. And I'm still kind of reeling from its collateral damage.
And it's likely a strong contributor to the mental health crisis that we see in both children, teens, and adults. And of course, you're not alone in this, growing up in a family where toxic achievement is modeled and prized. And you are absolutely right that the origin is in scarcity mindset and catastrophizing. And to be fair, we were taught a lot of this, not just in our own families, but society talks about it. And even schools talk about it. And the way that we apply to college talks about it. Even the way we apply to kindergarten these days brings up this idea. And I believe that everyone in medicine has some level of this toxic achievement culture instilled in them because some of it was necessary. And it's not something that we potentially would like to perpetuate. And so, what I see though is that if parents decide to opt out of it, and I will say that I have very much decided to opt out of it very intentionally, and it takes a ton of work. And nonetheless, those thoughts that maybe you don't care enough, or maybe you're not doing enough, or maybe you are not failing your child, but maybe something bad will happen because you're not opting into it. Again, it brings us back to this trust that everything will be okay in the end. And so I want to call out that we can choose to opt out of it, and that still creates some level of stress because it's so ingrained in us, and it's just a work in progress. But I do think you're calling out that it's caused you harm is extremely important, and a reminder that as physicians we took an oath to do no harm, and yet very often we've done harm to ourselves. And we can choose to opt out of that for ourselves now, but we can also choose to opt out of that for our children.
And I think where the toxicity comes in is where we equate achievements to worth. And honestly, for myself, it has been an exhausting journey to do that. So I just want to take a moment right now to remind all of us, simply by existing as human beings, we are absolutely worthy, and we are more than enough. And all of us are worthy of love and kindness from both ourselves and others.
And a moment here to reflect on the words enough and worthy, because for me, interestingly, those words are super triggering. And I know for some people, they practice, I am enough, I am worthy, and they get there. But when I think about those words, they bring up, am I enough? Well, then what's not enough? And am I worthy? Then someone's not worthy. And I start to get in this noisy conversation because it feels to me like an accomplishment or something. I know you're saying you're born with it, but if your brain goes to that, I have found that for me to start with a discussion of maybe I'm not inadequate, or maybe I'm adequate, or maybe I'm average, or maybe I'm above average. And those comments and word choice actually allow me to get out of the noise. And I usually land on, oh, I'm way above average. And then I believe it, or I fight for it. If I'm an adequate parent, I'm like, I'm a better than adequate parent. And then I don't have to be not worthy or not enough. and the catastrophizing and all or none-ness falls away.
I wanted to share from Wallace's book where she recounts a story where she met psychologist Richard Weisbrod from Harvard, who said that certainly in this kind of post-pandemic integrated world where the world has just undergone years of uncertainty, that high achievement is now seen by many parents as a life raft in an unpredictable future. So this episode is not to blame any of us for having been indoctrinated or ascribing to toxic achievement culture, but rather to bring about some insights and just reminding everyone that you can choose to opt out of that habitual achievement culture.
In that opting out takes time and practice. And I also think some people are able to just opt out all at once, 100%. Others of us take 1%, 5%, 10%, and that whichever type of person you are, take that path. So interesting also that they are talking about toxic achievement culture as a life raft. And Shauna Shapiro talks about self-compassion as a life raft. And what comes to mind for me is love as a life raft. And this loops back to this idea that I like to come to, which is what is your job as a parent? And I like to think of this as the most important question you can ask if you're wanting to parent with presence or be present for your children. And as I see it, and you can create your own version, what is a successful parent? So for me, it's our job as a parent is to love our children, to keep them out of danger. And I want to use the word danger, I mean serious danger. Because there are many things in life that happen that are not in our control. So within your control to keep them out of danger. And then I consider my job to raise mostly happy, mostly healthy, mostly independent, mostly responsible young adults who want to spend time with me. And I always add that want to spend time with you, because if you are always telling them they're not doing enough, they may or may not want to spend time with you. And so having a relationship that is authentic and aligned. And so many people say, well, that's fabulous, but how do you do all of that? And my thought is many of the same ideas come up here: being mindful, being intentional, being curious, asking yourself good questions. What kind of a parent do I want to be? What do I want to be modeling for my children? And remembering that what we model is much more powerful than what we say. So we can tell our children that we want them to opt out of toxic achievement, and yet if we're still taking leadership role after leadership role and defining ourselves by external validation, that's a confusing message. So some caveats here, and I'd love to have you toss in any that come up for you too, Ni-Chang, is it is a journey to opt out. It's a long one. You can opt out of regret from the past about how you've handled it, or anger perhaps about how you were raised. And that in order to change, we have to be kind to ourselves. Coming from self-compassion, we can't hate ourselves into being different parents. We also have to be kind to our nervous systems. And so if you find yourself triggered or in fight or flight because of scarcity mindset, it takes practice. And so judging yourself doesn't help, but compassion does.
So, as always, we like to close our episodes with some reflection questions for you.
Where are you showing up, even if quietly, judging yourself as a parent or your children? What if you and your children are already adequate, above average, more than enough?
Reflecting back on your own life, what aspects of your life were ascribed to toxic achievement culture?
What kind of parent will your future self wish you had been?
How do you think you can opt out of toxic achievement culture for yourself and for your children.
And how might you feel if you do? Thanks for listening to this episode, and we encourage you to take a listen to the other episodes in our Parent with Presence series. There are a lot of fun and interesting ones where we touch on topics like this and topics around coaching and topics around connecting with your children, and there will be more coming in the future. And every year I do offer a Parent with Presence small group coaching, and it will happen later this spring. So reach out if you are interested. And stay on after the sound of the singing bowl for a mindful moment offering.
Thanks so much for joining us.
We encourage you to dive into the show notes for each episode for more learnings and resources.
We also invite you to take a listen to the many other Mindful Healers podcast episodes. And please share the podcast far and wide with colleagues, friends, and family.
If our message and approach resonate with you, we would love to work with you.
When you listen to a podcast, you consume information, but when you work with us, you can actually practice and change.
We offer coaching and mindfulness experiences, talks, workshops, retreats, and more. Connect with us at themindfulhealerspodcast.com.
The content of this podcast is not medical or life advice. We invite you to participate in the mindful moments we offer at the end of most of our podcasts, but please only do so safely. Welcome to today's mindful moment offering. An invitation for you to close your eyes if it's safe for you to do so, or lower your gaze a few inches in front of you. Settling in, perhaps taking in the thoughts, emotions, body sensations after listening to that episode. All that's arising without judgment. Simply noticing. Grounding into points of contact between you and the surrounding environment, like the support of the ground beneath your feet, or the chair, or whatever it is that you happen to be standing or sitting upon. And simply noticing that support. Which is unconditionally present for you. You simply have to notice. As we notice periods of time where toxic achievement culture has been the norm in our own lives, in the lives of our loved ones, recognizing that we can choose a different path, one that is more gentle and kinder, dropping the judgment. Simply noticing when it arises and reminding yourself that you can choose differently. Coming back to the sensations of grounding and support, thinking about who is in your support network that you can share, that you can lean on. knowing that support is unconditional. You simply have to look for it. Thank you so much for practicing with me today.